A mother sits at her computer, playing a game about growing crops. Behind her, her 3-month-old baby cries. Within minutes, the baby is dying. And the question that still haunts this case is not just, how could she do it? It is this: what happens when frustration, isolation, and obsession collide with the most vulnerable life in the room? This is the case of Alexandra Tobias, a 22-year-old mother from Jacksonville, Florida, and her infant son, Dylan Lee Edmondson. In 2010, Tobias pleaded guilty to second-degree murder after admitting she shook her baby while playing FarmVille on Facebook. Before we go further, this story involves the death of an infant. There will be no sensational reenactments of the violence. We are going to focus on the facts, the warnings, the psychology, and the failure points that led to a child losing his life. If you value documentary storytelling that treats victims with dignity, subscribe and stay with me until the end. Because the most important part of this story is not the game. It is the baby no one protected in time. To understand why this case became international news, we need to go back to 2010. Facebook was no longer just a website for college students. It had become a daily habit. People were posting statuses, sending friend requests, tagging photos, and, increasingly, playing games. One of the biggest was FarmVille. Launched by Zynga in June 2009, FarmVille became a viral phenomenon almost instantly. Zynga says it reached 1 million daily active users by the end of its first week, and later peaked at 32 million daily active users. Stanford's Graduate School of Business described FarmVille as reaching 30 million daily active users in 6 months. The game was simple. You planted crops. You harvested them. You checked back before they withered. You invited friends. You built a small digital world that rewarded routine, attention, and repetition. It was not a violent game. It was not a crime simulator. It was cartoon farms, cows, fences, crops, and timers. That is part of what made this case so disturbing, because the headline sounded almost impossible. A baby killed because he interrupted FarmVille. But headlines can flatten a story. They make one object, one game, one moment feel like the entire explanation. The truth is darker and more human than that. FarmVille did not kill Dylan Lee Edmondson. Alexandra Tobias did. And the game was the setting where her anger finally crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Alexandra Victoria Tobias was 22 years old. She lived in Jacksonville, Florida. Her son, Dylan Lee Edmondson, was only 3 months old. At that age, a baby cannot explain pain, hunger, fear, exhaustion, or discomfort. A baby cries because crying is the only language available. According to the CDC, crying, including long periods of inconsolable crying, is normal in infants, but it is also one of the most common triggers in abusive head trauma cases because caregivers can become angry, overwhelmed, or desperate. That does not excuse violence. It explains the pressure point. On January 19, 2010, Dylan was crying while Tobias was at the computer. She later told investigators she became angry because the baby's crying interrupted her while she was playing FarmVille. According to reporting from the Associated Press and local Jacksonville news, Tobias admitted that she shook him. Then she stepped away and smoked a cigarette, apparently trying to compose herself. But when the crying did not stop, she shook him again. She later said the baby may have hit his head during the shaking. Emergency responders were called after Dylan stopped breathing. He was taken to the hospital. He did not survive. In many child abuse investigations, the first explanation matters. Not because it is always true, but because it often reveals panic. Reports say Tobias initially gave another explanation for Dylan's injuries. One account says she claimed the baby had been knocked from a couch by a dog. But doctors and investigators saw injuries that did not fit a simple accident. The medical conclusion reported in the case was abusive head trauma. The American Academy of Pediatrics uses the term abusive head trauma rather than only shaken baby syndrome, because these cases can involve violent shaking, blunt impact, or both. The CDC describes abusive head trauma as a severe brain injury caused by inflicted blunt impact and/or violent shaking. Babies under 1 year old are at greatest risk. Why? Because an infant's head is large compared to the body. The neck muscles are weak. The brain is still developing. A violent act that an adult body might survive can be catastrophic to a baby. The CDC states that as many as 1 in 4 babies who experience abusive head trauma die. Dylan was one of them. 3 months old, not old enough to crawl, not old enough to speak, old enough only to cry. In October 2010, Alexandra Tobias pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. She entered the plea before Circuit Judge Adrian G. Soud. The prosecution said her plea spared Dylan's family from reliving the tragedy through a full jury trial. Second-degree murder in Florida could carry a life sentence, but state sentencing guidelines in this case were reported as 25 to 50 years. At the time, prosecutor Richard Mantei said the sentence could be shorter than life because of those guidelines, but the court made no promise. The case was scheduled for sentencing, and by then, the story had already exploded. Not just because a baby was dead, but because of the detail that traveled around the world. She had been playing FarmVille. The media knew exactly which part of the story would travel. Mother kills baby over Facebook game. FarmVille mother shakes infant to death. Baby dies after interrupting online game. It was horrifying, shareable, and almost absurd. But here is where we need to be careful. A bad documentary would make this a story about video games. A better documentary asks a harder question. What was already broken in that home, in that mother, in that moment, before FarmVille became the final distraction? Because millions of people played FarmVille, they did not kill their children. The game matters because it shows us where her attention was. It shows us the absurd contrast between a fake digital farm and a real infant needing care. But it is not the root cause by itself. The root cause was a caregiver's violent loss of control. And that distinction matters because if we blame only the game, we miss the real warning signs. Rage, isolation, untreated mental health issues, poor coping skills, lack of support, and a baby's crying being interpreted not as communication, but as an attack. That, to me, is the most chilling part. Dylan was not doing anything wrong. He was being a baby. On February 1st, 2011, Alexandra Tobias was sentenced. She received 50 years in prison, the maximum penalty under the plea agreement range reported by News 4 Jax. Before the sentence, Tobias addressed the court. According to News 4 Jax, she said she was not asking for pity, but for mercy. She said the death of her son was a life sentence in itself, and asked the judge to consider that she was still young and had ambitions, potential, hopes, and dreams. That statement is difficult to hear, because it is human, but it is also painfully incomplete. She had a future, Dylan did not. She could speak to the court. Dylan never got to speak at all. And this is where my own thoughts are strongest. Remorse matters, but remorse after the fact does not resurrect the person who paid the price for your rage. There are moments in life when walking away for 5 minutes is not weakness, it is survival. Put the baby in a safe crib, leave the room, call someone, cry in the hallway, punch a pillow, sit on the floor, Do anything except put your hands on that child in anger, because the distance between frustration and tragedy can be one terrible moment. And in this case, that moment became 50 years in prison for Tobias and a lifetime stolen from Dylan.
One of the most disturbing details repeated in secondary accounts is that Tobias had reportedly joined a Facebook group advocating against baby shaking about a month before Dylan's death. If true, the irony is almost unbearable. A public click toward awareness, a private act of violence. But even here, we should resist making the story too neat. Awareness is not the same as self-control. Joining a group is not the same as having a plan. Knowing something is dangerous is not the same as having the emotional tools to stop yourself when your body is flooded with anger. That is why prevention programs focus not only on telling caregivers, "Do not shake a baby," but on what to do when the crying becomes unbearable. Because the dangerous moment is not when someone is calm and reading advice online. The dangerous moment is 3 a.m. The dangerous moment is exhaustion. The dangerous moment is when the baby has cried for an hour and nothing works. The dangerous moment is when the adult starts thinking, "I can't take this anymore." That is the moment prevention has to reach. Abusive head trauma is one of the leading causes of child abuse deaths in young children. According to the CDC, it can happen when a caregiver becomes angry or frustrated because of a child's crying. It may involve shaking, throwing, hitting, or impact. The injuries can include bleeding around the brain, bleeding behind the eyes, swelling, brain damage, seizures, blindness, developmental delays, physical disabilities, hearing problems, or death. The American Academy of Pediatrics emphasizes that caregivers need safe strategies for coping with crying infants. That means checking basic needs first. Is the baby hungry? Wet? Too hot? Too cold? Sick? In pain? Overtired? But if nothing works and the adult feels anger rising, the next step is not to try harder while enraged. The next step is to put the baby down safely. A crib, a bassinet, a safe sleeping space, then step away. A crying baby in a safe crib is safer than a baby in angry arms. That line should be taught everywhere. The FarmVille detail still matters because it says something about attention. In 2010, social games were engineered around return loops. Plant now, harvest later. Check before the crop withers. Invite friends. Keep the streak alive. Today, the games have changed, but the loops are everywhere. Notifications, short videos, live streams, online arguments, gambling apps, shopping carts, endless feeds. The danger is not that technology turns ordinary people into killers. That is too simple. The danger is that technology can absorb attention at the exact moment real life needs us most. And parenting, especially early parenting, is full of interruptions. Babies interrupt sleep. They interrupt meals. They interrupt showers. They interrupt work. They interrupt games. They interrupt who you thought you were before they arrived. A healthy adult understands that this is part of caregiving. An overwhelmed, unsupported, angry adult may experience that interruption as a threat. That is where a baby becomes vulnerable, and that is where the adults around the caregiver matter. Partners, family, friends, doctors, neighbors, social workers, communities. The question is not only, why did Alexandra Tobias do this? The question is also, who knew she was struggling? Who could she call? Who checked on Dylan? What systems failed to see the danger before the ambulance arrived? Dylan Lee Edmondson lived for 3 months. That is almost no time at all. And yet his story has traveled for more than a decade because it represents a fear people do not like to say out loud. Sometimes the person closest to a child is the person most capable of harming them. This case is remembered as the FarmVille killing. But I do not think that should be its final meaning. It should be remembered as a warning about rage, a warning about isolation, a warning about the gap between knowing better and doing better, a warning that babies do not need perfect parents. They need safe ones. Alexandra Tobias got 50 years. Dylan got 3 months. And no headline, no prison sentence, no viral outrage can balance that equation. So if there is one thing to take from this story, it is this. When a baby's crying pushes someone to the edge, the answer is never force. Put the baby somewhere safe. Walk away. Call for help. Let the baby cry for a few minutes if you must, because a few minutes of crying can be survived. One moment of violence may not be. If this story made you think differently about child safety, frustration, or digital distraction, share it with someone who needs to hear that message. Subscribe for more documentary stories told with facts, empathy, and respect for the victims. And remember Dylan Lee Edmondson not as a headline, but as a child whose life mattered.